Hello. So, one of the things I've been trying to figure out how to talk about is cognitive load, what it is, how to think about it, how to avoid it, and why it matters. Cognitive load is sort of related to cognitive overload, right? Brainwashing, IQ, things like that are sort of indicators of cognitive load, right? Um, Although how susceptible you are to things like hypnosis does not seem to correlate with IQ. Just saying, might be important. And the cognitive load that you have as a human being varies pretty widely between you and your peers. And you kind of see this, right? Where you see something, say, in a book or in a movie that they didn't see, right? Or you're driving along and you see a car when they kind of didn't, right? These are all functions of cognitive load. So cognitive load seems to be independent of IQ entirely. Um, Lots of things are independent of IQ. It's good to know. And it seems to have more to do with attention and the level of detail you're able to see, which is related to attention but might not be the same thing. And it's very easy to get overloaded cognitively because it's not just a matter of, well, say, you have 9 cognitive load points, and unless they give you 10, you're fine, right? It's much more subtle. Some people are susceptible to certain cognitive tricks because their cognitive load in that particular area of thinking is just low for whatever reason. And I don't think you can change this at all. I just think you're born with a certain capacity of cognition, and that's it. And I have strong indications it's completely independent of IQ. Some people just cannot pay attention to two things at once, no matter how hard they try, and other people seem to be able to pay attention to multiple things at once. So one example of this is, I read this years ago. I probably talked about this before on the channel, but if I haven't, I'll talk about it now. Um, Guy wrote to Quora and said, what, extra sense do you have or something? And the guy said, actually, my extra sense is a sense of time. And I went, somebody else can do that too. And then he proceeded to describe how he drives his girlfriend crazy because he can effectively do many things at once. And what happens is he'll start making breakfast while he's, engaging in some coding, while he's cleaning up the house, right? And like, most people can't juggle 3 tasks at once, but some of us can. And the way we do that, some of us, is not all of us, is through timing. Our internal clocks are very good. Now, I never needed a watch as a kid. I had one, but having one was bad for me because I had OCD, so I'd look at it constantly. Before I got sick, always knew what time it was. I always just asked me what time it was, and I always just knew, within the actually about 5 minutes, which isn't too bad. Usually less than 5 minutes, but I don't know why. I don't know how this happens. I can't explain it. Just something that I can do or could do before I got sick. Occasionally, when I feel better, I can just tell you what time it is, and I'm pretty accurate. And other people can do this too. Not too many of us, though. And so we're just different. Like, that's fine. There's nothing wrong. Some people are different. They can keep track of different numbers of things. There's nothing particularly wrong or bad about that. It just kind of is what it is. And so once you realize that, you go, oh, we have different levels of cognition. Yes, we do. One thing that you can do to anybody, pretty much anybody, obviously, when we say exceptions to this, some people have amazing cognitive load. Probably some of the higher IQ people that are super articulate, some of whom aren't very bright, actually. They miss things logically, but they seem to be able to track a lot of stuff. And so they catch people in lies. And they're also able to construct very elaborate stories that seem like they must be true. But one of the reasons why they're able to do that is because they cognitively overload their listeners. They're not doing this on purpose, right? I'm not saying that, it's something that they're malicious about. Some are, but most are not. And I'm going to try to do that for you here. We'll see how successful I am. You can overload people pretty easily just by bombarding them with lots of facts in a very short amount of time. And the trick is you bombard them with lots of facts. You don't give them time to think about how coherent those facts are, right? How well they hold together, but they sound good. And there's different ways to make things sound good, right? There's tonal enchantment, right? Where you use a low, slow voice, sort of like Sam Harris, very soothing, right? There's a logical consistency where you say things that sound logical together, right? That's a form of articulation that's very, very good way of enchanting people. It doesn't require a good voice. It doesn't require the low and slow. It's harder to spot, right? It sounds good. It sounds like it makes sense, right? So there are various methods. I'll get into that, in another video, I'm sure, at some point about enchantment and types of enchantment. But I'll just tell you a story about Netflix. Now, one way to think about Netflix is that, it's very successful because it had the largest library of movies and TV shows, which it could stream, right? And it got that from having the best contracts in the industry. Over time, the industry was more than happy to give them these contracts because they had content. They couldn't pawn it all out. It was already sold to TV stations. They're under contract. They can't sell it to two stations in the same market at once, right? But Netflix isn't in a single market. So they're not subject to those contracts, and they're not subject to those rules, and they're not using the same transmission method. So for them, it's just an extra outlet to sell stuff. And, they didn't seem to be a threat because they didn't overlap with the broadcasters. Nobody, it wasn't a choice between broadcast TV, cable TV, and Netflix. That wasn't the choice. Netflix is relatively small. In the meantime, they're becoming a large corporation by innovating with new technology and better, different business practices. Right now, everything I said is technically correct. Of course, I said a lot of stuff in a fairly short amount of time. You don't have time to look all that stuff up, I'm sure. Maybe you know about some of it, or you believe some of it, right? But I've left a lot of context out, but I've added in only the positive context, right? Now, I can try it again effectively on the other side of the register, right? So I can say what Netflix doesn't talk about is that their hiring strategy is basically to outcompete the rest of the market on talent, right? By overpaying everybody way above market rate. So they overpay their everybody at the company, but mostly their software engineers at way above market rate. They give them golden handcuffs, and they convince their developers that they have more freedom at Netflix because they can just release whenever the hell they want, right? No one stands in their way. You think you got a change that you want to push out, you just push it right out to the production network. That is what they tell people. And they also don't tell you they hire the best of the best on purpose, right? They're stealing from the rest of the industry, and they fire very aggressively. Every manager, at least in the beginning, was told, you should ask yourself, if this person left, would I miss them? And if the answer is no, then fire them now. Don't wait. It's a very well-known strategy by them, by the way. And that is part of their, methodology behind how they run their companies. Very cutthroat. Okay. Now, everything I said is true. Puts Netflix in a very different negative light. None of what I said is incorrect, but none of it gives you a full picture of Netflix, the corporation. Now, I'm not going to come down one way or another on Netflix. I did cancel my subscription to Netflix at one point over a particular movie. And Tim Pool sort of pushed that, and he was correct, and he demonstrated that. And so I said, I'm done giving these people my money. I don't watch very many movies anyway, so it's not a huge loss to me. I probably would never bother to work at Netflix. I'm not saying if they offered me $1 million, I wouldn't change my mind. I'm saying, I never pursued them as a company to go work for, because I usually don't do that anyway. The problem is when you throw a bunch of facts at people and you put those facts in negative or positive light, it's very easy for them to get overwhelmed and just believe the narrative that you're selling them, because they don't have time to look all that stuff up or even think about it. Does it make sense that they hire the best of the best? How do they know they're hiring the best of the best? Well, they fire aggressively. That's not the same as hiring the best of the best, right? Does it make sense that they're offering the developers more creativity? Not really, because the app doesn't change much, right? Hasn't, right? Just what are you doing? It's not very complex, right? You're just playing movies and TV shows. Next movie, next TV show, right? There's some back end work that gets done. That's pretty cool. They do way more releases than I could possibly imagine. But basically, there's nothing on the outside that impacts anybody, so to speak. It hasn't changed in years, the interface, and nor should it, right? Necessarily. It changed a little bit. Maybe the recommender gets a little bit better or a little bit worse. Not really stuff that people can hang their hat on. So, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of facts I shove at you very, very quickly. And it all makes sense because it's all true and it all makes sense. Like I made sure it made sense to some extent, hopefully. And you had to default to the negativity or the positivity of the framing, right? When I use fire aggressively, right? And business strategy, outcompete. These are very loaded words, right? They're framing words. They're not, and they're judgment words, right? I'm making judgments. I'm not saying like, oh, they tend to fire people fast when they fail. That's a much friendlier way of saying they fire aggressively, right? I could say their business is focused on getting their customers the best content as quickly as they can with the least amount of downtime. That is a business strategy. When you say business strategy, it sounds more cutthroat. That's just the way it is, right? Outcompete, right? What do you mean outcompete? Outcompete on talent? What do you mean outcompete on talent? That's a very negative word, right? Outcompeting. You're not competing. Competing would be good. You're outcompeting. You've got some advantage that you're using, right? And so those are very negative terms. Golden handcuffs, right? Not generous employment package, which is also what it is. Golden handcuffs, right? Convincing their developers, right? Not explaining to their developers how much freedom they get by coming to work there. They're convincing the developers, right? And so because I'm putting together this picture, because I'm sending a lot of facts at your brain very, very quickly, you miss all the framing and judgment words entirely. Almost everybody does, right? And they get an emotional response to that while they're trying to keep track of all these facts, and that's cognitive overload. It's one form. There's other forms, but that's one form of cognitive overload. Hopefully, you got the feeling that they were a good company that did good things in the first description, and you were slightly less happy about Netflix in the second description. And again, I'm not going to come down on one side or the other, but that's part of the trick. Now, maybe you didn't fall for it. Congratulations, you're top 1%. But also you're top 1%. This is useless information. Because other things will cognitively overload you. Don't think that because my example didn't work, if in fact that's true, that somehow you're immune. That's not true. I'm sure I could craft something given more time that will blow your brain away. It's not that hard. People are limited. You spend enough time and you'll be able to smoke anyone. It's not that hard, right? People spend years on this stuff, on coming up with good narratives. I would argue that's maybe what dictators did in the 20th century, right? Was come up with really good narratives and blow people's brains out because they couldn't see the contradictions. They couldn't see the inconsistency, the irrationality, the illogical behavior or words. Couldn't see that the conflict because you can't. And, cognitive overload has a lot of different interesting side effects. One of them is that people get shy when they're overloaded, right? They don't want to speak, right? They're more likely to, if not go along, appear to go along, right? They're less likely to speak up because maybe they can't track all the points and they don't want to look like a fool. And so they just stay quiet, right? And that doesn't mean those people are wrong, right? Just because they're unconfident about their opinion because they've been cognitively overloaded, right? But it does mean they won't speak up, right? They, and maybe they can't tell how right they are. They can't tell what their confidence level is. They can't tell how certain they are that what the person said was false. And so they don't speak up. And the less people speak up, the more agreement is assumed. And so that's how cognitive overload scales to groups, right? As groups get more silent, and more emotional. They express the emotion, right? Based on the framing and the judgment words that, again, you're going straight into your subconscious, basically straight into your unconscious mind. And so they speak in unison. I mean, this is mob rule, mob mentality. There isn't a thing called the mob. Somebody implants things into your head, or maybe multiple somebodies. It doesn't have to be one person or one leader or one authority. It doesn't have to be that way, but people get implanted. We're all out here. Why are we all out here? We're out here to make change happen. Yeah. Yeah, we're out here to make change happen. Absolutely. Yeah, and then people repeat it. Repetition is a method of cognitive overload. You're going to pin. It's called pegging. That's Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Pegging. You're going to peg to something you hear repeated, right? That's a form of cognitive overload, just repetition, cognitive overload, right? And then you're going to pay attention to that. The world is attention, Jonathan Peugeot, right? You pay attention to that. That's going to swing your thoughts in a certain direction, right? It's part of brainwashing, right? It's how you brainwash somebody. And it's also gaslighting works that way, right? Same thing. And so you do all this, and mob mentality, mob rules happens, right? And of course, you're not really in control of a mob because who knows what they entrained on, not just you. And Tim Pool has a wonderful story about this at Occupy Wall Street. One of the cameramen was trying to have a third person perspective picture, and the mob started following him, and he was like, I can't get away from the mob. And the mob wouldn't follow the leader anymore. And the leaders were like trying to guide them. No, this way. And the cameraman was trying to run down back alleys, and the mob's following the cameraman. They lost control, because you almost always do. Most people lose control of mobs unless you're very, very good at what you do and you're very, very, very well studied. You will lose control of your mob, no matter how many people you have helping you. That's the lesson there. And I forget how long ago Tim Pool talked about this, way before the catastrophe of the virus, we'll call it. So certainly these things happen, and mobs are an example of cognitive overload, right? Because they're not thinking for themselves anymore, because they can't afford to, because they're in a large enough group where what you say and how you speak out matters, right? The leader's not going to come and get you. That's not the fear. Like, people who really control things control the people on the ground next to you, not the hierarchy. The hierarchy is not dangerous. Hierarchy is a good filter to protect you. But the mob is not going to protect you. The mob is going to take you out. That's what the mob is going to do. So you need to be very careful. So when you start looking at mob mentality, mob behavior, or reading about it, or whatever, you will notice the cognitive overload in there. And look, not everybody in a mob falls for cognitive overload. They leave, though. Typically, they go, oh, this is bullshit. I'm out of here. And they take off. And fine and fair. That doesn't solve the problem, right? It may solve the problem for them. Fantastic. The problem is not them. The problem is not solving the problem for one person or handful of people, 1%, 10%, 30% of the population that doesn't fall for it. The problem is all the people that do fall for it, because they get overloaded. Now, techniques to avoid this are to pay attention to framing. I, of course, have videos on frames and framing. You should probably watch one of those, or at least this one. And I have multiples. And paying attention to that is really important, because you can figure out if somebody's being, we'll say, independent in their thought, right? They're not trying to inject bias in to the best of their ability. No one's perfect. It doesn't matter, right? But it does matter how hard you try, right? Or whether or not you call out your bias. I usually call out my bias. I don't subscribe to Netflix anymore. Not a fan of the company. Not for the reasons I listed, by the way. Right? That was an experiment to show you cognitive overload, which hopefully succeeded. Let me know in the comments, by the way, if that succeeded. The key is to be able to pay attention to if there's an emotion rising in you, right? If there's an intellectual appeal made, or a rational appeal, or a logical appeal, right? Or reasons were given, right? Or if it's more emotional or more about repetition, right? Especially a repetition that's never questioned, right? So it's easy to repeat something like, this is unconstitutional, okay? It's easy to discern if something's unconstitutional. You can just go read the Constitution. It's not that hard. You can argue about interpretation and things like that, but at least there's an independent thing to grasp onto. It's much harder when the chant or the mantra or whatever you want to call it is, more in the emotional appeal range. Like, we won't go until our demands are met. Okay. Were you told about the demands before you showed up? Were those demands specific? Right? What exactly are those demands? Are they reasonable? Right? Are they logical demands? Are they going to arrive at what you want? Or are they more like, we want it to be in control and not have you in control? Because a lot of demands really boil down to that, boil down to who's in control. And the mob, or people leading the mob, rely on threat of force, right? It's force or threat of force. That's top-down power from above, postmodern narrative, right? Force or threat of force is power to give them what they want. Now, what they want and what they told the mob they would get are almost never the same thing ever. That's good to know. Just historically, you do a quick historical, study, a little bit of research, and figure out, if you want the ultimate example, you can go to the French Revolution, obviously. And look, I got a video on that with Adam. My videos with Adam are awesome. Adam's awesome. So you can watch that, kind of get a feel for, hey, wait a minute, this didn't work. The mob didn't work. They didn't get what they were promised, right? And they didn't do the work. They weren't the ones fomenting the revolution. They were the ones being manipulated and cognitively overloaded and given false beliefs so that they would use force. That's how force happens, or one of the ways. It's one of the best ways that force happens. This is all from cognitive overload. These people are baking bread in the streets or growing things or going off to work. They are not reading books and figuring out what political structures are and what philosophy is best to run the country. Is it really, Hobbesian, or, is it more Lockean? They're not doing that, right? And so you're telling them what Hobbes and Locke said and what that implication is for a government with no king, and they're buying it because what do they know? They don't know. And you're probably throwing a bunch of big philosophical terms at them, and all they want is lower bread prices. Because quite frankly, it's a little ridiculous. And bang, cognitive overload right there. They're hungry, and you're appealing to some ridiculous intellectual thesis that you have about why you can get rid of the king and why it doesn't matter and how, hey, it worked for the United States. They made it work. We can make it work too, right? Nonsense. It's bonkers. And then you get Napoleon. Cognitive overload. Napoleon knew, hey, I'll take away your cognitive overload. I'll just be in charge. You don't have to worry about all these rabble rousers and this constant revolution that you're stuck in. That might be a key. How do revolutions end? Right. When the people doing the cognitive overload die. Right. The killing machine kills the people who started the revolution or the people who are continuing the revolution. Revolution dies. Didn't happen in Russia for very good reasons. I'm going to cover that in a future video with Adam, hopefully soon, right? These are functions of cognitive overload. If you spew Marxist propaganda at people, and it's all wrong, by the way, and it's very obviously wrong, so I don't know how this ever worked, then they will get overloaded, and they will believe communist manifestos and stupid things that are so just on their face contradictory that it's hard to imagine anybody engaged with this garbage and didn't immediately burn those books, because they're full of lies and ridiculous statements and foolishness. That's cognitive overload. And that's what happens to people. And that's what you have to watch out for. Are these emotional appeals? Are they just repeating the same axioms over and over again? And if you want a video on me sort of trying to figure out how to explain to you to notice what people's axioms are, let me know in the comments. That's also a lot of work, but for my people, I am willing to undertake that if enough people are interested. So look, Hopefully, this video wasn't entirely cognitive overload for you and you got something out of it. Please leave some comments. Let me know. Spread this to your friends if it's helpful, because I think it will be. And thank you very much for your time and attention.